Hey, what's going on everybody? It's Mr. White here with your final exam review video. I know, it's been a long time. You've been watching a lot of videos. You gotta be tired. I'm sure your hand is hurting. But stick with it because here we are, we're at the last one. You're almost ready for your final exam. And I know that you must be dedicated because you wouldn't have watched all these videos if you weren't. So here we go, guys. We are picking up with Cold War till the present. This is the last about 15 questions of the test review. So we're gonna be going from number 84 through number 100. So here we go. Number 84. What were the USA and the Soviet Union competing for during the Cold War? They wanted political influence over other countries. You may remember that they went all over the world and they wanted everybody to be like them. So if you were in America, you wanted everybody to be a democracy with free enterprise. If you were the Soviet Union, you wanted everyone to have a totalitarian government with a command economy, aka communism. Okay? So number 85. What is the purpose of the United Nations? Well, the purpose of the United Nations is to prevent the outbreak of wars in the future and to stop atrocities like all the genocides that we saw happen in the 20th century. As we can see, the UN hasn't been perfect at that, but hey, at least they're trying. Alright, so number 86. What was the domino theory? Well, it was not the theory that your pizza should arrive in 30 minutes or less, although I do like that theory. No, the domino theory was part of the Cold War. Remember, that was the idea that if one country falls to communism, then other nearby countries will also fall to communism. This is a big reason why the United States got involved in the Vietnam War. We were very worried that if communism was allowed to take hold in Vietnam, that it would spread to other parts of Southeast Asia. Alright, so moving on, number 87. What were the US and Soviet Union referred to as after World War II, therefore leading to the Cold War? Well, the USA and the Soviet Union were considered the first superpowers, meaning the first countries on Earth that had so much more power than everybody else that they were essentially above everybody else. Superpowers. Okay, so number 88. What were some of the main events of the Cold War? Well, there were a lot of things that happened in the Cold War. For example, there were lots of smaller wars that were actually not very cold. And so, you know, those would probably be some of the things you need to know about, like the Korean War and the Vietnam War. But of course, there were other kinds of competitions going on that weren't really fighting, like the space race and the nuclear arms race. You know, even though we were building weapons, we weren't actually using them on each other. Some other things that happened during this time were like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we almost had a war with Russia over missiles that were being brought to Cuba. And one of the more happy events of the Cold War was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that happened in the early 90s. Okay, so number 89. What was the Iron Curtain and what kind of economic systems were found on either side of it? The Iron Curtain was an imaginary line. It was not an actual wall or a curtain, but it separated the free half of Europe from the communist half of Europe. The free part of Europe was the western part of Europe. So everything on the western side of the Iron Curtain were countries that had free enterprise in their economy and democracies as their government systems. Everything on the east side of the Iron Curtain were the countries that were living under totalitarian governments that were mostly using communism as their economic system. So, pretty straightforward. Number 90. What was containment? Containment was part of the US strategy during the Cold War. It was the idea that the United States should help other countries fight against the spread of communism. So, for example, when communism started to spread into South Korea, it was our idea that we should help the Korean people fight against communism. So we sent them weapons, and eventually we even sent in US troops to help them fight against communism. Alright, so number 91. What happened to the Cambodians under Pol Pot's leadership of the Khmer Rouge? Well, the Khmer Rouge was a communist totalitarian regime that took over Cambodia in the mid-1970s. What he did was he led a politically motivated mass murder, aka a genocide, against the intellectuals and the city people of Cambodia, because he was trying to follow Mao Zedong's example in China of creating a perfect agricultural society. He thought basically everybody should be farmers. If you didn't agree that everybody should be farmers, then you would usually find yourself in a concentration camp where they tortured you and usually eventually killed you. Not a very fun time in Cambodia. All right, so number 92. Describe individual rights before and after the fall of the Soviet Union. Oh my goodness. We know all about individual rights, and there are a ton of individual rights. But you may remember that before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, people didn't have very many individual rights. Before the fall, there was a communist government, so that kind of tells you a lot right there. The citizens were not allowed to criticize the government in any way, so just saying something bad about the government could get you thrown in jail. The governments controlled everything that happened in people's lives. They controlled the books, they controlled all the art, they controlled the music, they controlled the news. Everything was under the control of the government. The government also had a ban on religion, and that's not something we talked about very much during this school year, but religion was not allowed in most communist countries. They actually thought that religion made people unequal, okay? And last of all, the government controlled the economy, and that often led to problems like food shortages. So things weren't so good before the fall of communism. However, after the fall of communism, things got a lot better. For one thing, leaders began to be elected by the people. Another thing that happened was that citizens were allowed to criticize the government. If you didn't like something the government was doing, you were actually allowed to say so after the fall of communism. There was also more free expression in things like literature and art, and the media was finally allowed to tell the truth for a change. People started having religious freedom, so if you wanted to have a religion, you were allowed to. And eventually, people were allowed to own their own businesses, and that led to an increase in all the products that people wanted, like food and luxury goods. But at the same time, it also led to an increase in crime. So it's not like everything was perfect after the fall of communism, but I think we can agree that things got a whole lot better. All right, so number 93. Why did the U.S. change its foreign policy after World War II? You may remember that after World War I, the United States became isolationist. We didn't want to get involved in anybody's problems. We kind of thought that the rest of the world should just sort themselves out. But we realized that by doing that and leaving that vacuum of leadership, it led to the rise of dictatorships and eventually a Second World War. We also realized that punishing the countries that we defeated in war was a bad strategy because it left them feeling angry and bitter, like the Germans. So instead of doing that after World War II, we decided that the United States had to have a stronger commitment to world security and international leadership. So we needed to step out and take the lead since we were the strongest country, and we needed to set an example for everybody else. We also needed to help those countries that we defeated in World War II to get back up on their feet. That's why we invested so much money in that thing called the Marshall Plan, to try to help the countries of Europe rebuild. All right, so number 94. How did European imperialism affect the boundaries of African countries in the 20th century? Well, we spent a lot of time talking about the Berlin Conference. You could always go back and watch the Berlin Conference video lecture if you forgot about that one. But remember that the boundaries that were drawn by the Europeans at the Berlin Conference, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago at this point, those boundaries became the boundaries of the countries that we see in Africa today. So, check out this map of Africa. So all those borders you saw on the map of Africa, I know it's hard to believe, but there are over 50 countries in Africa. All those borders, with a few exceptions, were drawn by Europeans. And so a lot of the problems that we see in Africa today stems from the fact that the Europeans didn't take into consideration who they were drawing these boundaries around. So sometimes we see groups that don't like each other lumped together in the same country, or we see groups that want to be together separated between several different countries. And that's led to a lot of problems for Africa in the 20th century. All right, so number 95, speaking of Africa, what happened during Rwanda, the Rwanda genocide? The Rwanda genocide happened because there were two tribes living in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutus felt like the Tutsis had sold out when the Europeans ruled Rwanda. the Tutsis worked together with the Europeans. So when the Europeans left, the Hutus tried to eliminate the Tutsis as a way to get revenge. Once again, if you forgot about this one, go back and watch that Berlin Conference lecture video. It talks all about the situation between the Hutus and the Tutsis in case you forgot. All right, so number 96. What event in 1948 began the violence between Arabs and Israelis, and why? Well, the Arabs and Israelis both claimed sovereignty, meaning control, over the same piece of land. The area that we call the Holy Land, originally it was called Palestine. Today it's called Israel. And so because of the fact that both groups of people thought that they should control that land, that's why even today those groups can't agree and they're still fighting. All right, so number 97, almost there. What is globalization? Globalization means a unity of culture across the globe, but it's also a unity of businesses and people. We talked about this in class pretty recently, so you should remember that globalization is that interconnection of people all over the world. So the fact that nowadays you can go to just about any country in the world and buy a Coke, or buy an iPhone, or get a pair of Nikes, that's a perfect example of globalization, because those companies started in America, but now they're all over the world. They're worldwide. All right, so number 98. Why is terrorism difficult to defeat? You may realize or remember from class that there are lots of different causes of terrorism. Things like poverty and bad governments and even sometimes historical causes like, this group did something bad to us a long time ago, so now we're going to get revenge. So until we eliminate those root causes of terrorism, like violence and poverty and bad governments, the chances of totally eliminating terrorism are pretty slim. And unfortunately, it's not easy to eliminate things like poverty or bad government systems, and so that's why terrorism has been very difficult to fight against. All right, number 99. What are some examples of mass genocide in the 20th century? Well, we've talked about a lot of them. We just talked about Rwanda a few minutes ago. Remember, that's the country in Africa that had a genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis. There's this other part of Africa called Darfur. You may remember that from when we did our QR notes about genocide. They're the ones that are just south of Egypt, where you've got the black Africans fighting against the Arab Africans. Bosnia, it's a part of Europe. You may remember that in Bosnia, at the end of the Cold War, there was a fight over which ethnic groups would control which parts of former Yugoslavia. So you had a group of people called the Serbs trying to ethnically cleanse or completely wipe out other ethnic groups in a place called Bosnia. Kosovo is a place that's nearby Bosnia. It's actually formerly a part of Serbia. Sort of the same kind of thing happened in Kosovo. And Armenia. And we talked in one of the earlier videos about how the Ottoman Empire committed a genocide against the Armenian Christians during World War I. So those are some pretty good examples of 20th century genocides. Make sure you remember those. All right, and number 100. Oh my God, here we are at the very end, guys. Who was Margaret Thatcher? Well, she was known as one of the most important leaders of the 20th century for a lot of different reasons. She was a Prime Minister of Great Britain. She happened to be the first female Prime Minister of Great Britain. She was also one of the longest serving Prime Ministers in British history. She worked with the US President Ronald Reagan during the 1980s to try to bring an end to communism. She also promoted free enterprise, and she was a strong advocate for cutting welfare and other expenses that the government had to pay for. That was something that made her pretty controversial, especially in Britain. But despite all the controversy, she's still remembered as one of Britain's greatest leaders. Wow. Well, guys, here we are. You finished your whole final exam review. You got all those answers. Your paper's looking all awesome like mine. Oh, wait. That's the blank side. Yeah, there we go. That's the awesome looking side. So your paper probably looks pretty good by now. But remember, I don't give you a grade just for filling this thing out. Your job now is to actually study this stuff, and there's a lot of it. So trying to look at this like 5 minutes before you walk into the classroom to take the final, probably not gonna work. You're gonna need to actually devote maybe 1 or 2 nights before the test to actually quizzing yourself, reading this stuff, have somebody else quiz you, because if you don't do that, I promise you, you're not gonna remember all of this stuff, okay? So watch the videos again if you need to, read over your test review, whatever it takes, but guys, the main thing is please, please, please pretty please, study, okay? So, it's been a great year. So glad that you've all been watching my videos this year, and I really hope that you enjoyed them, or at least tolerated them pretty well. I hope that they helped you to be successful, and you know, who knows, maybe we'll cross paths again in the future. But whatever happens to you guys over the summer and in your next couple years of high school, I wish you the best of luck. Come by and say hi if you get a chance, and I guess I'll see you when I see you. I feel blessed. Straight up, straight up.